Regulation 7. Subsection C of the Frontier Prisoner Treatment Code says exactly one thing about wounded enemy combatants held for interrogation: sustain them, do not comfort them. Nobody at Outpost Kestrel Hold ever thought that single word, comfort, would end up defining the next chapter of the war. This is the story of how a tired man with a ladle in his hand accidentally did what 4 years of failed peace talks could not. My name doesn't matter for this account. I'm the one who compiled the incident report, pulled the security footage, cross-referenced the interviews, and sat across a metal table from both the medic and the Orc Warband's second-in-command to figure out what actually happened, because the official record and the truth turned out to be two very different documents. I was attached to the Frontier Compact as an observer, which is a polite way of saying I was sent by people far away from the fighting to make sure the people doing the fighting weren't making things worse. Usually my job is boring. Usually I write reports that get filed and forgotten. This one didn't get forgotten. This one got read aloud in a war council chamber by a general who had to stop twice because his voice kept catching. I want to tell you what happened at that outpost, out on the Ashlands border, where the Human Coalition and the Orc clan territories have been grinding against each other for longer than most of the soldiers stationed there have been alive. I want to tell you about a medic named Ellis Rourke, a captive Orc warrior who almost died in a supply closet, and a warband commander who marched 300 armed Orcs up to a human gate, not to burn it down, but to kneel in front of it, because, after 4 years of watching this war eat good people on both sides, I didn't think anything could still surprise me. I was wrong. And I think, by the end of this, you'll understand why the Orcs were wrong about us too, and why that mattered so much more than anyone expected. Let's start at the outpost, because you need to understand what kind of place this was before you understand how strange it was that any of this happened there. Kestrel Hold isn't the kind of base you put in a recruitment poster. It's a scab of gray reinforced concrete and rusted watchtowers, sitting on a ridge overlooking a dead river valley. The last human holdfast before 60 miles of contested ashlands that neither side fully controls. It exists for one reason: to watch the pass. Whoever holds Kestrel Hold sees anything moving through that valley long before it reaches the real population centers to the south. It's not glamorous. It's not comfortable. The wind never stops, the water tastes like rust, and the soldiers stationed there rotate out every 4 months because command doesn't like leaving people on that ridge longer than that. Morale problems. Isolation problems. The kind of problems that come from staring at a valley full of Orc war parties for months at a time, waiting for the day they decide to come through in force. Tax. The Orcs on the other side of that valley aren't the mindless raiding hordes that show up in old human war propaganda, the kind with tusks and no thoughts beyond violence. That's not what I found when I actually started talking to them, and it's not what the soldiers of Kestrel Hold believed either. Not really, even if the official briefings still use that language. The Orc clans out there are organized into warbands, each one loyal to a chieftain bound by codes of honor that are, frankly, stricter than a lot of human military codes I've read. They value strength, yes. They value combat prowess, absolutely. But they value something else even more, something that doesn't get mentioned enough in the human accounts of this war. They value debt. A life owed is not a small thing to an Orc. It is not a metaphor. It is closer to a physical law, something woven into how their clans function, how their loyalties get built and rebuilt across generations. I didn't know that going into this investigation. I know it now. 3 weeks before the incident, a routine patrol out of Kestrel Hold ran into an Orc scouting party in the lower switchbacks of the valley. It wasn't a large engagement. 6 humans, 4 Orcs, a brief ugly fight in the rocks that left 2 humans wounded and 3 Orcs dead. The 4th Orc, badly wounded, tried to retreat and collapsed a quarter-mile from the ambush site. The patrol brought him in alive, mostly because the patrol leader, a sergeant named Okonko Reyes, had standing orders that any live capture with intelligence value gets brought back rather than finished off in the field. That's standard doctrine. Live prisoners get information, dead ones don't. The Orc's name, as it turned out later, was Gorak Thane Breaker, and he was not just any scout. He was the younger brother of Vorn Thane Breaker, chieftain of the Ash Wolf warband, one of the larger and more disciplined orc forces operating along that stretch of the border. Nobody at Kestrel Hold knew that when they dragged him in. To them, he was just a wounded orc combatant, tagged, catalogued, and thrown into the holding cell that used to be a supply closet before someone welded iron bars across the doorframe. And he was in bad shape. The fight in the rocks had opened a gash along his ribs that had gone untreated for the better part of a day. Before capture, an infection had already started to set in by the time he reached the outpost's medical bay for the mandatory triage check. Now, here's where regulation becomes relevant, and where I need you to understand exactly what the rules said, because the rules are the whole reason this story is remarkable at all. Frontier Compact Directive on Prisoner Medical Treatment states that captured combatants receive triage sufficient to prevent death from immediate battlefield injury for the sole purpose of preserving intelligence value. That's it. That's the mandate. Stop the bleeding, stabilize. No more. No pain management beyond what's operationally necessary to keep the prisoner conscious for questioning. No extended care. No supplemental rations beyond the bare minimum caloric floor required to keep a body from starving. And that floor is set low, deliberately low, because command didn't want outposts wasting stretched supply lines on enemy combatants who might not survive interrogation anyway. It's not written down as cruelty. Nobody phrases it that way in the manual. It's phrased as efficiency. Resource allocation under wartime constraint. But cruelty by another name is still what it produces, and everyone stationed on that ridge knew it, even if nobody said it out loud in the mess hall. Ellis Rourke was the outpost's senior combat medic, and he'd been at Kestrel Hold for 14 months, longer than almost anyone else on the ridge, because he kept volunteering for extensions nobody else wanted. I asked him about that later, why he stayed so long in a posting. People usually begged to leave. He shrugged and told me the valley needed a medic who knew its specific ways of trying to kill people, frostbite patterns, unique to that wind, snakebite protocols for the ash vipers that nest in the scree, the way infections behave differently at that altitude. He said somebody had to know all that cold, and once he knew it, leaving felt like abandoning a post nobody else was ready to fill. That's the kind of man Ellis Rourke is, quiet duty, dressed up as no big deal. He was 34 years old, unmarried, from a farming town most of his squad mates had never heard of, and by every account I gathered, he was well liked, without being particularly notable. Not a hero, not a troublemaker. The guy who remembered your name and your allergies and didn't ask questions when you came in with an injury you didn't want to explain. Steady, competent. The kind of person an institution runs on without ever really noticing him. When Guruk was brought into the medical bay that first night, half-conscious, ribs laid open, running a fever that had his whole body shaking against the restraints, Ellis did his job. He cleaned the wound, packed it, stitched what needed stitching, and gave him exactly the treatment regulation allowed. No more, no less. That's what the record shows for day one, and that's exactly what happened. Because on day one, Ellis Rourke was still just following the rules, like everybody else. It's day two where things start to shift, and it's worth sitting with that shift for a second because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a decision made with trumpets and moral speeches. It was small. It was quiet. It was, according to Ellis himself, barely a decision at all. He went to check the prisoner's wound dressing, standard follow-up, and found Guruk awake, chained to the wall by both wrists in that repurposed supply closet, staring at the floor with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that showing pain in front of an enemy is its own kind of surrender. The daily ration allotted to prisoners at Kestrel Hold was, by regulation, half of a standard field nutrition bar and roughly a pint of water. That's the caloric floor. That's what keeps a body alive without wasting supply. Ellis had delivered it that morning per protocol. He told me later that what got him wasn't the wound. He'd seen worse wounds. What got him was that Guruk hadn't touched the ration at all. It sat untouched on the floor of the cell, and when Ellis asked why, more out of medical concern than anything else, since an infection fighting a starved body doesn't heal, Guruk told him. in the rough-clipped trade common that serves as the language bridge between human and orc territories out on that border, that he would not eat food, given like scraps, to a chained dog. He said, a warrior eats what he earns, or what is offered with respect, not what is thrown at him, to keep him breathing for someone else's convenience. Ellis said that stuck with him more than he expected. He told me, and I'm going to give you this close to verbatim, because I think the plainness of how he said, it matters that it wasn't really about the orc specifically. It was that he'd spent 14 months on that ridge patching up soldiers who ate hot food in the mess hall every night without thinking twice about it. And here was somebody, enemy or not, deliberately choosing to go hungry rather than accept being treated like livestock. He said something about that. Sat wrong in his chest, and he couldn't explain it better than that. So that night, after his shift technically ended, Ellis Rourke did something that violated Frontier Compact Directive on prisoner treatment in a way that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone with authority to enforce it had found out at the time. He took his own dinner, a full ration, not the half-bar allotted to prisoners, but his actual soldier's meal, and he brought it to the supply closet. He didn't throw it through the bars. He didn't slide it across the floor like feeding an animal. He unlocked the small hatch used for water delivery, and he handed it through directly, the way you'd hand something to a person. He told Guruk, through the limited trade common he'd picked up over his tour, that this was given, not thrown. That there was no debt expected. That a wounded man doesn't heal on nothing, war or no war. And that Ellis wasn't interested in watching someone starve to death out of stubborn pride when it was preventable with something as simple as his own dinner. Guruk didn't eat it that first night either. Ellis told me that too, and he told me it made him respect the orc more, strange as that sounds. He said pride like that, the kind that would rather sit hungry than accept charity from an enemy, was something he understood. He grew up around men like that. His own grandfather, according to Ellis, went 2 days without eating during a bad harvest year rather than take help from a neighbor he had an old grudge with. Some kinds of stubbornness cross species lines just fine, but the second night Ellis came back. Same routine. His own ration handed through the hatch. No ceremony, no speech, just handed across like it was the most ordinary transaction in the world. And this time, Guruk ate. I want to pause here and talk about why this detail, the eating, the accepting, mattered so enormously more to the orcs than any human soldier at Kestrel Hold could have possibly understood at the time, because this is the crux of everything that happened 3 days later, and if you don't understand orc culture on this specific point, the ending of this story is going to look like magic instead of what it actually was, which is a very old and very serious law being triggered by accident. I spent considerable time after this incident, interviewing orc elders and clan historians through the Compact's limited diplomatic channels, trying to understand exactly what Ellis had stumbled into. What I learned is this. Among most orc clans along the Ashlands border and the Ash Wolf warband specifically, there exists a concept that translates roughly to blood bread. It refers to food given freely without coercion to someone who has no power to refuse or retaliate, offered by someone who has no obligation to give it. The key elements are freedom and asymmetry. The giver must gain nothing. The receiver must be entirely at the giver's mercy. And crucially, the giver must know this and offer anyway. This concept exists because of how orc warfare traditionally worked. Before the current conflict with humanity, back when orc clans fought each other as often as they fought outsiders, prisoners taken in interclan warfare were traditionally starved or executed, full stop, no exceptions, because feeding an enemy captive was seen as wasteful sentiment that a chieftain couldn't afford. But over centuries, a counter-tradition grew up around the rare cases where it did happen, where some individual guard or captor, moved by whatever private reasoning, fed a helpless captive anyway at personal cost, expecting nothing back. Those cases became legendary within orc oral history, specifically because they were so rare, and because of what it revealed about the person who did it. An orc elder named Skarn Ironhide Voss explained it to me this way, through a translator, and I wrote his exact words down, because I didn't want to lose the shape of it in translation. He said, "Among my people, cruelty, to a captive tells you nothing, because any coward can be cruel to someone in chains. But kindness to a captive who cannot repay it, who cannot even threaten you, who has nothing to offer but hunger and hatred, that tells you everything, it tells you the giver's strength is real, because only someone truly secure in themselves gives something away, expecting nothing back. Weak men need repayment to feel safe giving. Strong men do not. That framework produced a specific binding tradition. If a captive receives blood bread from a captor and survives to tell his own clan about it, that clan incurs what they call life debt, not to the individual only, but often extending to that individual's larger community, depending on the severity of the captive's condition and the clarity of the gift. Life debt isn't a metaphor or a suggestion. It's treated with the weight of sacred law. A warband that fails to honor a legitimate life debt is considered to have broken faith with their ancestors. And that's not a small accusation in Orc culture. It can fracture a clan's standing with allied warbands. It can cost a chieftain his authority. It is, from what I gathered, taken more seriously than most military obligations they hold. Ellis Rourke, of course, knew absolutely none of this. He was not trying to forge an alliance. He was not making a calculated diplomatic gesture. He was a tired medic who couldn't stomach watching a wounded man starve on principle. And he solved that problem the only way available to him, quietly, off the books at personal cost, expecting nothing in return. Which it turns out is exactly the formula the Orcs consider unforgeable. You cannot fake blood bread convincingly, according to Skarn, because any performance of generosity done with an audience in mind, done for advantage, curdles the moment the intent behind it is examined. The Orcs believe they can tell the difference, and whether or not that belief has any basis in some deeper truth, it clearly mattered enormously to what happened next. Ellis kept feeding Gurak for the full 3 days. The Orc remained in custody. Every night, his own ration, handed through the hatch. He, also in violation of a second regulation, spent time treating the wound beyond the minimum required, cleaning it properly, changing dressings more frequently than mandated because he told me an infection left half-treated just becomes a longer, uglier death, and he wasn't interested in participating in that, prisoner or not. He talked to Gurak during these visits, slowly in broken trade common, patched together with hand gestures, and over those 3 nights he learned a few things about the Orc that never made it into any official file, because Ellis never reported the conversations. He learned Gurak had a younger sister back in Ashwolf territory who was training to be a healer, which Ellis found darkly funny given the circumstances. He learned Gurak had lost his father in a battle against a rival Orc clan years before this war with humans had even started, and that his brother Vorn had raised him afterward more like a father than a sibling. None of this, Ellis insisted to me later, changed what he thought about the war, or made him question his duty, or turn him into some kind of pacifist. He was very clear about that in our interview, almost defensive about it. He said, "I didn't feed him because I stopped believing in what we're doing out here. I fed him because watching someone starve to death slowly in a supply closet felt like something I couldn't live with afterward. And that had nothing to do with which side of the fight he was on. I believe him." I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this story that gets told wrong, where Ellis Rourke becomes some kind of secret idealist plotting to undermine the war effort out of moral conviction. That's not what the record shows. What the record shows is a man responding to a specific, immediate, human problem in front of him with the only tool he had available, which was his own dinner and his own time, and doing it repeatedly because stopping felt worse than continuing. On the morning of the 4th day, Gurak Thanebreaker was scheduled for transfer. Command had decided he had enough intelligence value, given his identity as the chieftain's brother, once that fact was finally extracted from him during formal interrogation, to warrant moving him to a more secure facility further south, one better equipped for extended questioning. The transfer convoy left Kestrel Hold at dawn. 3 vehicles, a dozen soldiers, standard escort protocol for a high-value prisoner. They made it 4 miles down the ridge road before the convoy was intercepted. Now, I need to walk through what actually happened during that interception carefully, because the initial reports that came back to command described it as an ambush, and command's first assumption, understandably, was that the Ash Wolf warband had somehow learned about the transfer and moved to rescue their chieftain's brother by force. Given everything I've told you about life, debt, and honor codes, you'd think that's exactly what should have happened. Storm the convoy. Free the prisoner. Standard rescue operation. That is not what happened, and the gap between what command expected and what actually occurred is, in my professional opinion, the single most important detail in this entire incident. The convoy came around a bend in the ridge road and found the path blocked, not by an ambush position, not by war machines or archers in the rocks, but by a single unarmed orc standing in the middle of the road, with both hands raised, palms open, empty. Behind him, spread across the ridgeline in plain view, not hidden, not attempting any tactical concealment, stood roughly 300 orc warriors of the Ash Wolf warband, weapons sheathed, standing in loose formation that any soldier would recognize immediately. They weren't arrayed for battle. They were simply present, visible, and still. The convoy commander, a lieutenant named Priya Faulkner, halted the vehicles and radioed back to base immediately, describing the situation as, and I'm quoting directly from the after-action transcript, unclear hostile intent, large enemy force visible, requesting immediate instruction. Base Commander Colonel Adrian Voss, no relation to the orc elder I interviewed later, ordered the convoy to hold position and prepare for potential engagement while he scrambled additional forces from the outpost. This is the moment where the entire trajectory of the encounter could have gone catastrophically wrong, and it's worth sitting on that for a second. 300 armed orcs on a ridgeline, a nervous human convoy with a dozen soldiers and a high-value prisoner. Both sides one misunderstood gesture, away from a firefight that could have escalated into a full engagement between Kestrel Hold and the Ash Wolf warband, a fight the outpost, frankly, was not equipped to win if it came to open battle at that scale. What stopped it was the single unarmed orc in the road, who turned out to be Vorn Thanebreaker himself, chieftain of the Ash Wolf warband, standing exposed and defenseless in front of a human convoy that had every reason in the world to shoot him where he stood. According to Lieutenant Faulkner's later testimony, Vorn spoke first, in careful, deliberate trade common, loud enough to carry to the whole convoy. He said he came to speak, not to fight, and that his warband would not draw a weapon regardless of what happened to him personally in the next several minutes. He asked simply if the human commander of Kestrel Hold could come to receive him, because what he had to say concerned a debt his clan owed, and he intended to see it paid properly, in person, according to the old forms. Faulkner, to her enormous credit, didn't open fire. She held position, kept her weapon lowered, but ready, and relayed the message back to base, word for word. It took 40 minutes for Colonel Voss to arrive at the scene personally, along with a reinforced escort, 40 minutes during which 300 orc warriors stood motionless on that ridge and did not so much as reach for a blade, which Faulkner described in her report as the single most unnerving 40 minutes of her deployment. Worse, she said, than actual combat, because at least combat is a thing you understand. When Colonel Voss arrived, he found Vorn Thanebreaker still standing in the road, still unarmed, and the transfer convoy still holding position with Girak secured in the middle vehicle. Voss, I should say, is not a reckless man. He'd commanded Kestrel Hold for 2 years by that point and had survived that posting, specifically by being cautious, methodical, and deeply suspicious of anything that looked too convenient. When I interviewed him afterward, he told me his working assumption on the drive-out was that this was an elaborate deception, some kind of ritual stalling tactic meant to buy time for a flanking force to reach the outpost, while its commander and reinforcements were occupied on the ridge road. He told the assembled orc force, through a translator brought along in the escort vehicle, that he was listening, but that any hostile movement from the warband would be answered immediately and without mercy. Standard commander posture, appropriately cautious given the situation. Vorn nodded, apparently unbothered by the threat, and made a request that Voss described to me as the strangest thing anyone had said to him in his entire military career. Vorn asked to see the medic, not the prisoner. Not a negotiation for the prisoner's release, not terms, not demands, not a hostage exchange. P.S. Specifically by description rather than name, since he didn't know it, for the human healer who had tended his brother during captivity, the one who fed him. Colonel Voss had no idea what he was talking about. As far as the official record showed, and as far as Voss himself knew, Gurak Thanebreaker had received exactly the treatment regulation allowed, no more. There was no note in any file about supplemental feeding, no report of extended medical attention, nothing. Ellis Rourke's quiet 3 nights of violating protocol had left no paper trail at all, because he'd never filed anything about it, never told a single soul, never even mentioned it to the other medics on his shift rotation. As far as the institution of Kestrel Hold was concerned, nothing unusual had happened during Gurak's captivity whatsoever. So Voss, understandably confused, asked Vorn to clarify what he meant. And this is where Vorn told him, in careful, formal trade common that Voss said carried a weight he wasn't prepared for. About blood bread. About life debt. About how his brother, chained and wounded and expecting nothing but the bare survival ration his captors were required to give, had instead been fed from a human soldier's own plate 3 nights running, by a man who wanted nothing, expected nothing, and never once mentioned it to anyone who might reward him for it. Vorn said his brother told him everything upon release. During the standard prisoner exchange briefing that happens on the orc side, just as it does on the human side, debriefing returned combatants for intelligence and morale purposes. Gurak described the food, the wound care, the conversations through the hatch, and, most importantly, he described it as freely given with no strings, no leverage sought, nothing extracted in return. He told his brother, according to Vorn, that the human medic treated him like a wounded person rather than a captured animal, and that this distinction mattered more to him than the food itself. Now, I have to pause here again because there's a detail in the paperwork trail that matters enormously to how this all unfolded, and it's almost comedic in its bureaucratic irony given everything at stake. Gurak had actually already been transferred out of Kestrel Hold's custody by the time this convoy was intercepted moving toward the southern facility for extended questioning. Vorn's warband had not come to rescue him. They had come, entirely separately, to find and honor the man who fed him, because in orc law, a life debt of that magnitude demands acknowledgement, regardless of whether the original captive is freed or not. The debt exists independent of the prisoner's fate. It's owed to the giver, not triggered by the outcome of captivity. This is, I think, the detail that most completely upended everyone's assumptions at Kestrel Hold once the dust settled, because it meant the entire encounter had never been about a prisoner rescue at all. Command had prepared for a hostage negotiation. What they actually got was something closer to a formal diplomatic delegation, arriving not to make demands, but to discharge an obligation the Ash Wolf warband considered sacred and binding, regardless of military convenience. Colonel Voss asked Vorn what exactly he intended to do. Once he found this medic, and Vorn's answer, according to Voss's own account, which I cross-referenced against Faulkner's and against 2 other soldiers present at the scene, was this. He said his warband had traveled 2 days to reach Kestrel Hold, moving in full view rather than undercover specifically, so there could be no accusation of ambush or deception, because he wanted the human commander to understand this was not a trick. He said he intended to kneel before the man who fed his brother and pledge the strength of his warband to that man's protection and service for as long as the debt required, which, by the old customs of his clan, could mean years, could mean a lifetime, depending on how the debt was formally structured once both parties understood its terms. Voss told me later that his first internal reaction was disbelief bordering on suspicion. He genuinely thought for a moment that this was some kind of elaborate cover story, that Vorn was using the language of honor and debt to mask a more practical goal, perhaps establishing a foothold inside the outpost perimeter under the guise of ceremony. He said he'd seen enough manipulation over 2 years on that border to distrust anything that looked this clean. But then he asked Vorn a direct question, the kind of question a cautious commander asks to test sincerity, and the answer is, what finally convinced him this was real. He asked what would happen if the human medic in question refused the pledge, refused the debt, wanted nothing to do with any of it. And Vorn's response, translated carefully and repeated to me nearly word for word by two separate witnesses, was that the debt would still be owed even if refused, that his warband's honor required the offer to be made regardless of whether it was accepted, and that if the medic wanted nothing further to do with them, the warband would withdraw and consider the formal acknowledgement itself sufficient, though it would sit uneasily with them for a long time, because an unresolved debt of that size was considered a kind of ongoing spiritual injury to the clan. That answer, more than anything else, was what convinced Colonel Voss he wasn't dealing with a trick. A liar angling for tactical advantage doesn't build an off-ramp into his own story that cost him everything he came for. Vorn had structured his entire approach in a way that gave the human medic full power to reject the entire arrangement, and had done so before ever setting foot inside the outpost walls, which meant he wasn't negotiating from a position of trying to extract concessions. He was there to give something away on terms that couldn't be renegotiated in his own favor, no matter how the meeting went. Voss agreed to let Vorn approach the outpost, alone, unarmed, while the rest of the Ash Wolf warband remained on the ridge under close watch. It took another hour of careful, tense coordination, extra sentries posted, the base put on a modified alert status, before Vorn was finally escorted through the gates of Kestrel Hold, still unarmed, still calm, walking through a compound full of human soldiers who had spent the entire war being trained to see him as an enemy. Ellis Rourke at this point had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. He was in the medical bay, finishing a routine equipment inventory when a runner came to tell him Colonel Voss needed him in the main courtyard immediately. He told me his first thought was that he was in trouble, that somehow, impossibly, someone had found out about the ration violations, and he spent the walk from the medical bay to the courtyard, mentally composing his explanation, trying to figure out how he was going to justify 3 nights of broken protocol without making it sound worse than it was. What he found in the courtyard instead was Colonel Voss standing next to an orc chieftain he'd never seen before, and the entire off-duty population of the outpost gathering at a nervous distance, murmuring, trying to figure out what was happening. Voss asked Ellis directly in front of everyone whether he was the medic who had treated the orc prisoner Gurok Thanebreaker during his 3 days in custody. Ellis told me that in that moment he genuinely considered lying. He said the instinct to protect himself kicked in immediately, that he almost said he'd only done the minimum required, standard treatment, nothing more. But something about the way Vorn was looking at him, he said, made lying feel suddenly impossible, like it would have been an insult to whatever was actually happening, even though he didn't yet understand what that was. So, he told the truth. He said yes, he'd fed the prisoner his own rations for 3 nights and treated the wound more thoroughly than regulation required, and that he'd done it because he couldn't stomach watching someone starve when it was preventable, and that he understood this violated protocol and was prepared to accept whatever consequences came with that admission. He said he expected to be reprimanded on the spot, maybe worse. What he got instead was Vorn Thanebreaker crossing the courtyard, kneeling in the dust in front of him, and speaking words that Ellis didn't fully understand in the moment because his trade common wasn't good enough to catch all of it, but which the translator relayed to the stunned courtyard, a sentence at a time. Vorn said that his brother's life had been preserved, not by the mercy required of captors, but by a gift freely given by a man who owed him nothing and stood to gain nothing. He said that among his people such a gift is answered only one way, with strength offered in return, and that he, Vorn Thanebreaker, chieftain of the Ash Wolf warband, pledged the blades and lives of his warriors to the protection and service of Ellis Rourke, for as long as the old laws required such a debt to stand, which he estimated, given the severity of his brother's condition when the gift was given, to be no less than a full turning of seasons, and, quite possibly, longer, depending on how the elders of his clan ultimately weighed it. I want you to sit with the image of that for a second, because I think it's easy to hear it described, and miss how genuinely strange and unprecedented it was. A war chieftain on his knees, in the dust of an enemy outpost, in full view of human soldiers who had been trained for years to see his kind as a threat to be managed or destroyed, pledging loyalty, not to a diplomat, not to a general, not to anyone with rank or authority or negotiating power, but to a mid-level combat medic who fed him dinner because he couldn't stand watching a man go hungry. Ellis, by his own account, had absolutely no idea what to do. He said his first instinct was to tell Vorn to stand up, that this wasn't necessary, that he hadn't done anything worth kneeling over. He said he found the whole thing deeply uncomfortable, almost embarrassing, standing there while an armed chieftain knelt in front of him, and 300 orc warriors watched from the ridge, and every soldier at Kestrelhold stared at him like he'd grown a second head. But Colonel Voss, who by that point had regained enough composure to think several steps ahead of the immediate scene, quietly told Ellis not to refuse outright, not yet, and to let the moment play out, because whatever this actually was, it clearly mattered enormously to the orcs present. And rejecting it carelessly in front of 300 armed warriors on a ridge that could still, in theory, decide the negotiation had failed and respond badly was not a risk worth taking without more information. This is where I want to slow down and talk about what happened over the following hours, because the aftermath of that kneeling moment is in some ways even more important than the moment itself. This wasn't a single dramatic gesture that resolved everything neatly. It kicked off a genuinely complicated, occasionally tense, occasionally very funny negotiation between two cultures that had spent years trying to kill each other and now had to figure out on the fly what an orc life debt pledge actually meant in practical terms, and whether it could coexist with a war that was notably sinky. Still ongoing everywhere, except this one stretch of ridge. Colonel Voss brought Vorn, Ellis, and a small negotiating party into the outpost briefing room, the same room normally used for tactical planning against exactly this kind of orc force, which Voss told me he found almost darkly funny in retrospect. He had maps of Ash Wolf territory pinned to the walls, annotated with troop estimates and threat assessments, while the chieftain, those assessments were about, sat calmly at the table, discussing terms of a peace pledge with a medic who kept insisting he didn't need anything. And this all felt like a misunderstanding. The first real complication came when Ellis tried to explain that he didn't want 300 armed orcs pledged to his personal service, that this wasn't something he had any use for or any framework for managing, and that, frankly, the idea of being personally responsible for a warband made him more anxious than grateful. Vorn listened to this patiently through the translator and then explained something that reframed the entire situation for everyone in the room. He said the pledge was not primarily about personal service in the sense Ellis was imagining, bodyguards following him around, warriors fighting his individual battles. He said the deeper meaning of a life debt pledge, particularly one incurred toward an enemy combatant during active war, was a formal declaration that the debtor clan would not act against the interests of the person owed, and, by extension, could be called upon, under specific and limited circumstances, to act in defense of that person or their explicitly stated interests. He said the size of the gesture, 300 warriors traveling 2 days to make the pledge in person, was meant to communicate the seriousness of the debt, not necessarily to imply Ellis would need to command all 300 warriors personally for the rest of his life. This clarified things considerably, but it also raised the question that Colonel Voss, ever the cautious commander, immediately zeroed in on. If Ellis Rourke's interests were now bound up in a formal debt pledge from the Ash Wolf warband, and Ellis Rourke was a serving medic in the Human Coalition military, actively stationed at an outpost whose entire purpose was watching for orc incursions through that exact valley, what did that mean for the war? Could this debt be leveraged, weaponized? Was there a version of this where Ellis's obligations as a soldier and his position as debt holder created some kind of conflict that either side could exploit? Vorn's answer to this, when Voss asked it directly, was the moment that I think genuinely changed how the colonel understood what he was dealing with. Vorn said that a life debt pledge properly given could never be used to compel the receiver to act against their own conscience or their own people. He said this was, in fact, the entire point of restricting the tradition to gifts, given with no expectation of return. If Ellis had fed Gurik while trying to extract information, or trying to curry some future favor, or trying to manipulate the situation for personal gain, the gift would have been corrupted, and no debt would have formed at all. The purity of the original act, freely given, expecting nothing, was precisely what made the resulting obligation trustworthy. An orc clan that tried to weaponize a life debt pledge to force its holder into treachery against their own people would be seen, by other orc clans, as violating the entire sacred structure of the tradition, and would lose standing and honor throughout the wider Orc political landscape as a result. In practical terms, this meant the pledge functioned less like a weapon Ellis could deploy and more like a standing guarantee, a promise that the Ash Wolf warband would not act with hostility toward Kestrel Hold, specifically not while this debt stood unresolved, and that if Ellis Rourke's life or well-being were ever directly threatened by circumstances the Ash Wolf warband had power to address, they were obligated to respond, provided doing so didn't require Ellis to betray his own coalition or moral commitments. Colonel Voss, to his credit, immediately understood the strategic weight of what was being described, separate from the emotional weight of it. He asked carefully whether this pledge extended in any practical sense to the outpost itself, given that Ellis was stationed there, and his well-being was in a very direct sense tied to the outpost's survival. Vorn considered this for a long moment, consulted quietly with two of his senior warriors, who had accompanied him into the briefing room, and then gave an answer that effectively reshaped the strategic situation on that entire border. He said that while the debt was owed personally to Ellis Rourke and not to the human coalition as an institution, the Ash Wolf warband could not in good conscience threaten a place where the man they owed their honor to lived and served, without violating the spirit of the debt, even while technically respecting its letter. He said, further, that the Ash Wolf elders, once informed of the full details, would likely interpret continued hostility toward Kestrel Hold specifically as an act that dishonored the pledge, regardless of the broader war's continuation elsewhere. In blunt terms, and Voss made sure to get this confirmed multiple times before he let himself believe it, the Ash Wolf warband, one of the largest and most organized Orc forces on that entire stretch of border, was effectively taking Kestrel Hold off its target list indefinitely because of 3 nights of shared rations. I want to be careful here not to oversell the strategic implications, because the war itself did not end because of this incident. Other Orc warbands, unaffiliated with Vorn's clan, continued operating in the region. The broader conflict between the human coalition and the wider Orc territories continued for a long time after these events, and I don't want to give the impression that one medic's kindness single-handedly resolved a multi-year war, because that's not what happened, and it would be dishonest to frame it that way. But what did happen was still enormous in its own right. Kestrel Hold, a critical watch position on a dangerous stretch of contested valley, effectively gained a standing non-aggression guarantee from one of the most powerful Orc warbands in the region. A guarantee that no diplomat, no treaty negotiation, no formal peace envoy had managed to secure in 4 years of trying. And it happened because a tired medic gave up his own dinner 3 nights running to a man he had every institutional permission to let starve. The formal negotiations that followed over the next several weeks, which I was eventually looped into as the Frontier Compact's observer, once word of the incident worked its way up the chain of command, tried to figure out how to structure this arrangement in a way that made sense within existing military and diplomatic frameworks. Because frankly, nobody had a policy for this. There was no regulation, no precedent, no procedural category for what to do when an enemy warband voluntarily pledges non-aggression to a low-ranking soldier because of an act of kindness that technically violated prisoner treatment protocol. I sat in on several of those meetings, and I want to share one exchange in particular because I think it captures something important about how this whole situation forced everyone involved to confront assumptions they didn't realize they were carrying. General Marsh Okafor, who oversaw the entire Southern Border Command and had to be briefed on the incident personally because of its strategic implications, asked Ellis directly, in one of the follow-up meetings, whether he had understood at any point during those 3 nights that he might be creating some kind of diplomatic opening. Ellis said no, immediately and without hesitation, and then almost apologetically added that he still wasn't entirely sure he understood what he'd created even now. Weeks later, sitting in a room full of officers and Orc representatives discussing the strategic ramifications of his dinner habits, Okafor asked him why he did it then, if not for any strategic reason. And Ellis gave an answer that I wrote down, word for word, because I think it's the most honest and important thing said in the entire investigation. He said, "I've spent 4 years watching people on both sides of this valley die of things that didn't have to kill them, wounds that got infected because nobody had time to treat them properly, cold that killed men who could have survived it with one more blanket, hunger that broke people down slow instead of fast. I got tired of watching that happen to my own side and telling myself there was nothing I could do about the other side of it, because the rules said I wasn't supposed to care. I didn't feed him because I thought it would end anything. I fed him because I was standing there with a full dinner and he had nothing, and I couldn't find a good enough reason inside myself to let that be okay. Okafor didn't say anything for a long moment after that. Then he asked Vorn through the translator whether that answer matched what the Ash Wolf elders had been told about the incident, whether the account was consistent with what Gorak had reported. Vorn said it matched exactly, and that this consistency was in fact part of what made the debt so absolute in the eyes of his clan. He said a gift given for strategic reasons carries the taint of its purpose no matter how it's dressed up. And Orc elders who have handled diplomacy with humans before have learned to sense the taint fairly reliably. What made Ellis's gift different? What made it trigger the oldest and most binding form of the tradition rather than some lesser courtesy debt was precisely that it had no purpose beyond itself. It wasn't generosity as strategy. It was generosity as reflex, the kind that happens before a person has time to calculate whether it's wise. I think that's the heart of this whole story, honestly, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before I tell you how the rest of it played out. The thing that moved 300 armed orcs to march 2 days across contested territory and kneel in the dust of a human outpost wasn't a clever diplomatic maneuver. It wasn't a calculated gesture designed to win hearts and minds. It was the opposite of calculation entirely. It was a man who couldn't stomach watching someone go hungry, acting on that discomfort in the smallest available way, without any thought of consequence or reward, because the alternative felt worse to him than the risk of getting caught. And I think that's actually consistent with something I've noticed across a lot of the interactions I've documented between humans and other species over the years I've spent doing this kind of work. Humans, as a species, seem to carry this stubborn, sometimes inconvenient instinct to treat the suffering in front of them as their business, regardless of what side of a conflict it's officially attached to. It gets them in trouble constantly. It violates protocol, undermines strategic clarity, complicates command structures that would function more smoothly if everyone just followed the rules as written, but it also apparently produces results that no amount of careful strategic planning ever quite manages to replicate, because it turns out that when you strip away every calculated motive from an act of decency, what's left behind reads as something closer to trustworthy than anything a diplomat could construct on purpose. The formal resolution of the incident, once the negotiations concluded, established what the Frontier Compact ended up calling, somewhat clumsily, a recognized honor accommodation, a legal framework hastily built to acknowledge that the Ash Wolf Warband's non-aggression pledge toward Kestrel Hold was binding on their side, regardless of the broader wars. Continuation, and that the human coalition would not interfere with or attempt to exploit that pledge for unrelated strategic advantage, a condition the Orc elders insisted on explicitly since they were understandably wary of human command trying to leverage Ellis's personal debt relationship. Ellis himself was given the option to formally accept or decline the pledge, in accordance with what Vorn had said back in that first courtyard confrontation, that the debt could be honored even in absence of acceptance, but the warband clearly preferred a mutual acknowledgement if Ellis was willing to give it. He told me, during our final interview, that he thought about it for 3 days before answering, which I think shows a level of seriousness that the whole situation deserved, rather than treating it as an easy honor to accept without weighing what it actually meant. What finally convinced him, he said, was a conversation he had with Gorak directly arranged. As part of the negotiation process, the first time the two of them had spoken since Gorak's transfer weeks earlier. Gorak told him, through the translator, that accepting the pledge wasn't about Ellis owing anything or being obligated to lead warriors into battle or take on some grand new role. It was about acknowledging that what happened between them in that supply closet was real, that it mattered, and that pretending it didn't happen or trying to minimize it out of discomfort would be its own kind of dishonesty. He said the debt existed, whether Ellis accepted it or not. Accepting it just meant being honest about that fact instead of hiding from it. Ellis accepted. The formal ceremony, which I attended as the compact's observer, was smaller and quieter than the initial dramatic, kneeling in the courtyard had suggested it might be. It took place at Kestrel Hold, with a reduced honor guard from the Ashwolf warband rather than the full 300, since Vorn explained that the initial full gathering had been necessary to demonstrate the seriousness of the debt to skeptical human commanders. But the actual acknowledgement ceremony was traditionally a smaller, more personal affair. Vorn spoke the formal words of the pledge again, this time as ratification rather than initial offer, and Ellis responded with words that Vorn had helped him prepare in advance, acknowledging the debt, acknowledging the gift had been freely given and freely received in return, and stating, in language that the Orc elders had specifically requested, that he held no ill will toward the Ashwolf warband or its warriors, war notwithstanding, and hoped that a day might come where the debt could be honored, not through defense against threat, but through some quieter form of mutual respect that didn't require conflict to prove itself. That last part, I later learned, wasn't standard language for this kind of ceremony. Ellis had added it himself, over Vorn's mild surprise, because he said he didn't want the entire relationship to be built only around war and threat and defense. He wanted there to be room, even if it was a small and uncertain room, for something that looked less like military alliance and more like actual peace, even if just between these specific people, on this specific stretch of ridge. Vorn, according to the account given to me by 2 witnesses present, was quiet for a long moment after hearing that addition, and then said, through the translator, that this was exactly the kind of thing that made humans difficult to categorize, difficult to fit into the old assumptions his people carried about the war, and that he suspected this particular addition, small as it seemed, would end up mattering more over the long run than the formal debt itself. I want to close this account with what happened in the months that followed, because I think the ending matters just as much as the dramatic mid.